Matt and JD are back, 44th FIDE Chess Olympiad 2022. The last round is done. Which game are we going to look at today, JD?
I wanted to look at the Sargassian versus Shirov game. I mean, Shirov used to be a monster. He was one of my favorite players for a long time because his games were always interesting and pretty exciting. And, now he's an old man. So we get to see how old men play chess.
Lower rating, but still like a tactical beast. He likes exciting chess.
Yeah, I mean, he is the top board for Spain still. I mean, I realized that he's from Latvia. He's like the second magician from Riga, right?
That must be. So this game starts off with a Slav, and we see this early queen to b3. This is something that I see a lot at the club level, both queen b3, queen c2. The idea is white wants to trade c pawn for d pawn and almost get like a Catalan-esque structure in a way.
I don't actually see this too much, but I suppose it's probably because I'm playing this E6 line, and I really don't see it at all.
That's
I
why,
mean, you
yeah.
you say that you see this quite a bit against the Slav, but like I was looking in the database, out of like 85,000 games, only about 2,400 of them were featured this line, so it's not super common. And we didn't see a whole lot in the way of big dogs that play this line either. There are a few top level games here, but for the most part, it was the your run of the mill lower level title players who play this.
Yeah, I think this is probably more of a surprise value for this level of play. So after
Yeah,
this
well, it seems
trade,
seems to work.
yeah, white gets a good position out of this. Bishop
Yeah.
g4, knight c3. So white wants just, hey, I'm going to build a big center. I'm okay with doubled pawns. Knight d7, bishop f4. And I like the white setup already. I feel like white's just putting all their pieces on good squares.
Yeah, and this is kind of similar to how we play against the Slav, only like in reverse. Like we're playing this bishop g5 and trying to swap here, and instead, white gets to be the one with the damage structure. So this is the kind of structure that we could be playing against with the black side. But so we've given up our knight for the bishop, so we do have a bishop pair. And technically, this does kind of help us develop slightly because we have this diagonal for our bishop. We get extra control over e4, but we maybe don't have quite such a clean home for our king now. I mean, the g file being open is nice for us if black does castle this way, but we don't want to castle with the open g file, and we have a c file open on the other side. So we get some pluses, but we sacrifice a little bit of king safety.
I think what favors white in this position versus our Slav in reverse is this pawn on c6. That makes it a little bit safer for the white king to go queenside. There's not a whole open c file. It also gives white the extra space in the center. So I think black really wishes this pawn was on d5. Maybe not in terms of like getting a dynamic game because it's a little bit more, symmetric, but
Mm-hmm.
it's better for black to have that space, I think, with the pawn on d5.
I hear you. So knight b6 comes. That feels like a weird move to me. But I suppose his point is maybe he wants to stick it on the d5 square. It is a tempo move, I suppose. And the queen does need to stay someplace in touch with this d pawn, so it drops back to d3. And now we do see the knight getting stuck here. So why the rush to put a knight on d5 and not something like e6 and bringing out our bishop?
I think because white has the bishop pair and the extra space and kind of this attacking potential down the g file, black wants to go to an endgame. I think black's thinking if I go to an endgame, your pawns get a little overexposed. I know you have the doubled pawns. I can start to create targets. So I think that's why black's in this rush. Let's get pieces traded off and head to the endgame.
All right, so takes, and then the bishop drops back. And now e6 comes and e4, taking this big giant center. I mean, this is a nice looking center, but this move does perhaps make the d4 pawn a bit soft.
And this is where
You're
we
not,
kind of get out of the book territory after knight c7. We're down to only 2 games remaining at this point.
and
And
one of them was this game.
yeah. And I really like white here. I think white's increased his advantage. Um, it's definitely not winning territory, but I don't feel like black has any compensation besides maybe this weak pawn on d4. White's got everything else in the position.
But he's got no, he has full compensation because he has the Caro-Kann pawn structure, which we know is like that's full compensation against almost anything.
So what are you looking for with the Caro structure? C5 or E5, right?
Yeah, c5, e5, and probably e5 here because I'm probably also going to castle this way.
And I like
And
what white did, though. Puts a rook on d1, which is often a good way to fight against these pawn breaks. Line the rook up with the black queen, and Shirov very aggressively brings this queen out to h4, getting off the d file and trying to poke at the white pawn structure a little bit. What do you think of that move?
I mean, I actually think it makes quite a bit of sense. I mean, he wants to get castled as quickly as possible and put a rook on the d file to help fight against white's d5. It's clear he doesn't want to castle short. It's
Yeah,
not clear where the dark squared bishop belongs. And so I think that this move actually makes quite a bit of sense. And I think that he's got an idea for how he can even trade off these dark squared bishops. I mean, from this position, just g6 and bishop h6 seems like would be a pretty solid way to go. So
I agree.
bishop e3 comes, and we do feature the castles. And now queen d2.
You know what this reminds me of? Our h3 kid lines where they put the queen out on h4. There's this idea, bishop g5. Sometimes you can trap that black queen. And on this next move, this is a really big decision by Shirov. He plays pawn to g6, looking for tactics. And again, this does remind me of our kid lines because there's the fianchetto over here. But there's a huge problem with g6.
Yeah, so let's look and see what he expected.
Yeah,
So
okay.
bishop g5 is what was played, and most of us think that this is like he just dropped a beginner tactic, but it's certainly got to be more complicated than that. So, and queen h5 is intended, and what Sheriff certainly expected was that he would take, but now bishop h6 comes, and it looks like we have a skewer on the queen, and you don't have quite so many good moves to choose from. I mean, you can choose between f4 and bringing the bishop back. I mean, with f4, we'll take here. We've got this good lineup. We've got here. The queen's going to come in. This f4 pawn's going to fall. And we're probably going to get 2 pawns for our exchange.
And
So
we went
bishop
deeper
coming.
in those lines as prep for this show, and we even saw sometimes an extra pawn comes too, right? Like multiple pawns are dropping, and white tries to break in the center. So very tactical game, and black's still in it there.
Yeah, and this way you can, if you just drop the bishop back, which is best, and then f4 has to come, you just drop the bishop right back. And again, this f4 pawn is going to fall for sure. There's no way to bring an additional attacker or defender. The queen is already the only one. You need like three moves to get a rook to defend that pawn, and you certainly can't advance it because your queen hangs. So you just develop. The queen comes to f3, and you're going to drop this pawn, and often one of these pawns too. And this must be what Shira was intending, because this does maintain rough equality, and I think that Black would probably be able to hold the game. But as it went, Sargassian said, "I don't want your rook yet. Your queen's out of squares. Like if we look, there's not so much in the way of squares at all here." So he plays bishop to e2, and now Sheriff's in big trouble.
Yeah, bishop's lined up with the queen, and the threat is to play a combination of h4 and f4. Bishop hits the queen. She has no squares. And I think here, all of a sudden, Shirov is like, okay, I got to do something. I got to save my queen. And he plays bishop to b4, trying to use tactics, counterattacking the white queen, so that if queen takes b4 is played, queen takes g5 with check. So obviously, queen takes b4, not a good move, but Sargissian keeps his cool, plays queen to e3, and this is kind of an interesting choice by Shirov, but it is one of the top moves. What did he play here?
Well, the problem is that you're going to play h4 to take away the h3 square, and then you're going to play f4.
Hmm.
Or maybe you're even going to play f4 immediately now, because the queen, that's one of the things that queen e3 did, is the queen's now covering that square. So f4 is a huge threat. So e5 is played, the point being that if you play f4, I'll take it. And I'm hitting your queen. Yes, you're hitting my queen. But if you try to do something like this, well, now all of a sudden, I'm black's the one that's crushing. So e5 is a tricky move. But he has a way of continuing on. He can just play queen h4. And what are you going to do? I mean, 96 is best. I mean, f4 is still a major threat. How are you going to deal with it? I mean, you could try to take this, but I mean, I'll just take it back. And I don't know. So you try to take my rook, and I'll just take this one. And this queen is still a
She
sitting
can't
duck.
escape. Yeah, she can't get
I
out of
can
there.
take I can take all the time I want just to bring my queen back and then play f4. And you haven't really accomplished anything. So this would have been the best way to play. But Sargassian just decides in exchange. I should be pretty happy with this.
And if
So the rook,
Sargissian wouldn't have won this game, we would be talking a lot more about that decision. Because to me, h4, looking at that line, it's super clean. Like, even if you follow the best variation for black, white's up a whole rook at the end.
yeah,
Whereas
yeah,
this
yeah,
line, we're only up the exchange. Maybe black could hold this position. So
maybe.
D takes E, queen takes, and we see here pawns are equal, same number of pawns. The imbalance is a rook for a knight. So at this point, white knows that he's winning, but he's got to figure out how to convert. Um, and we see in a couple moves, the rooks come off, and then the queens come off right here. And I think this was pretty much going to happen no matter what. So whether white takes or king b1, queen trade's going to happen. Takes, takes. And now we reach this endgame. And I think here you have to be pretty thoughtful as white to try to figure out what's a good plan to break through, because currently this rook cannot get active and attack the black pawns.
Yeah, people naturally think that just, hey, I'm up in exchange. I have a rook for a bishop. You think you're up a substantial amount of material, but really, what does it mean to be up that substantial amount of material? And it doesn't mean a whole lot unless you have plenty of open files. There's only one fully open file, and you're not getting in anywhere on this file. You can't go to the other half of the board at all. So over the next several moves, we're going to see white struggling, not struggling, but systematically and trying to improve the position and always sort of threatening to try to get additional open files.
Mhm.
Black on the mean side is going to be trying to keep things closed and putting just some pressure on some of these somewhat soft pawns. So knight to e8, just improving. We prevent the knight from coming forward. We also get the pawn on a dark square so that our light squared bishop has more scope. We attack the pawn, and yeah, this is interesting. There's several of these moments where white is willing to give up pawns if he can just get his rook active. Because with this bishop coming out to g4, he's threatening to come to d7. Gets to d7, this falls, this falls, this falls, this falls, and all of a sudden the rook turns into a hawk.
Yeah.
But we
So
can't do that.
pawn trades are going to be good for white in almost every variation. I also
A
kind of
few
want to,
pawn trades, not too many. You trade
yeah,
all the pawns off, and I'm pretty sure I can hold this.
yeah, don't trade every single pawn. Okay. One other thing I like about how Sargissian plays this going forward is watch how he tries to control the knight. So we already have this pawn on e5, guarding the forward squares of the knight. After takes, takes, bishop f3, now look at the squares this bishop guards, and look at the squares the knight wants to go to, right? So he's controlling the forward squares of the knight. And again, he's not worried about this bishop, because bishop takes e3, boom, pin the bishop to the king. So that's another case where black cannot grab a pawn safely.
Yeah, so h6. I mean, what else are you gonna do? It's hard to find a move.
Yeah.
I mean, your king is optimally placed. Your knight is as good as you can get it. I mean, I suppose you could shuffle your bishop around if you wanted to. But h6, h4. Again, maybe we're gonna advance someday and try to make this exchange so that I have a route, have another route in, perhaps. So the king comes forward. Already I'm kind of thinking about this sort of a move, but then this pawn does fall in that situation.
It's
So
almost a Zugzwang for black. Isn't that kind of crazy? Like, black
it
doesn't want to
is.
move any pieces, and then every time you push a pawn, you can't bring it backwards. So he's like gonna run out of pawn moves eventually.
Yeah, I like this. I like this maneuver with the king. He's kind of saying the d file is useless to me,
Mhm.
and at some point, this pawn really is going to fall. And so, over the next couple of moves, he just brings the king up to hold that pawn, and this frees the rook up. So now the rook's threatening to take g6. Kind of maybe this wouldn't have been an issue if we left the pawn back, but advance the pawn. Now the king defends. We move our king out of the way. We're slowly improving. Now we're threatening to take this pawn, and look where we forced the knight to in order to not lose the pawn.
Put black in a passive position. And I think it's worth noting here where to put the white king. So oftentimes players wonder, do I want him on the king side, queen side, center? The reason the king is so strong in the center is because this is where white has the extra pawn. And if you look at where black has their extra pawn, these pawns currently aren't any threat at all. Black does not want to push these up the board, allow that rook to get into the game. So this white king's, it's an obvious decision for white. I want the king behind these pawns so that I can support my passer going up the board.
And even further, Matt, you mentioned that white doesn't want to advance these pawns. Show me how you even can if you did want to.
I could
This
maybe
bishop
only
is a
push the A pawn.
yeah. I mean, this bishop's a monster holding both of these pawns in place. They cannot move right now. So the knight
Yeah.
comes up. Now that we're not attacking it, we defending this pawn. Seems like it's in a passive position, but that's going to change soon. Now the bishop drops back, and I like this plan that we have here. This is quite a nice idea. So the bishop comes, and we advance to e4. We're just going to take more space. And again, hilariously, the bishop attacks another pawn, which we do not care about. I mean, if you grab this bishop, perfect. I'm so happy because
Yeah.
now I get to play king to b1, and I'm gonna win the b. I'm gonna win b2. I'm probably gonna win b7, and I'm probably gonna go make a queen. So you can't take that pawn because you've given me the magical open file that I need. White's position is worse with that pawn on the board.
So here, bishop d4 was played, pawn to e5. I like this move too because I think knight to f6 could be a plan by black. E5 saying, I'm taking that square away and I'm reopening this thread on g6, meaning you're going to keep your eye on a knight f8 type defensive move because at some point, this rook may double attack your g pawn. And one cool thing here is white has this plan in mind. I think he might have it in mind here already. What do you think with the rook?
I think probably so because he's still trying to figure out where he can get this rook in, and if he doesn't get the rook in, you can ignore the eval because if the rook's not going to play, then he really is no better. So the
Yeah.
knight drops back, and the king comes up, sort of shuffling on the bishop, and then a bit of a committal move here to advance the pawn because now that pawn's kind of frozen in place. We've reduced the scope of the bishop, and we've made it a bit easier to try to exchange this pawn and open another file.
You know why he played it though? I think if you go bishop back to b6, there's going to be this combination of king e4 and the bishop potentially coming on this diagonal. And this bishop on b6 doesn't feel like it's helping defend these, squares around the black king side. It's kind of just like queen side only play. Points at g1, but it doesn't help a ton. So I think he wanted that bishop kind of eyeing this diagonal to come back and help. But as we see, this creates weaknesses for the black pawns as well.
Yeah, so the king just plants itself, and already the king is kind of eyeballing this sort of an idea.
Yeah, he is.
So b4, taking advantage, you can't take it. It's not a hanging pawn, and even if you could take it, I don't know if you'd want to.
This is
But
a super cool idea, and I think it's really deep too. He knows the pawn can't be captured, and in the next couple of moves, he's going to make this the weakest pawn on the board with a rook lift idea, rook h3, rook a3. And we both were thinking that he probably already had this in mind, if not this move, a couple moves earlier even.
yeah, it's for sure because I mean, so the king just comes over. We improve our bishop slightly. This bishop has nothing else much to do, so we advance the pawn. And this b5 idea, we've been talking about opening files and opening files and opening files, and now white closes. He closes things down, but it's not that he closes down and doesn't open up the b or c file. It's that this pawn is now fixed and can never move, and it's actually really hard to see how you're going to defend it. You've got to somehow get your king all the way over to here, or you can put a knight on c8.
It's this bishop has of two weaknesses. That's what it is. We have a7 and g6 now. If knight e6 is played, trade the knight right off. Rook can go after either of those pawns. And like you highlighted, that knight is just too clumsy to defend both. You can't guard both of these pawns.
And the bishop can't reach either pawn.
Yeah,
one because it's on a light square, and the other because all the dark square paths are cut off. So yeah, the knight comes up. We move the bishop to c4, literally just clearing it from the third rank. Nothing else important about that move. The knight drops back, plays king to h3 or rook to h3, and advances the pawn. I don't even know if this was strictly necessary, but does it? Now the king's placed even better. I mean, the king is just going to walk over and grab this pawn at any point. And after the knight makes one last sort of move, rook to a3 and resigns.
Yeah. This I think one cool thing with this F pawn for G pawn trade is it made the H pawn a new weakness, which this bishop could pretty easily pick up. So it's like a larger weakness for black than the G6 pawn. All right, so let's
No,
see. How could this game have continued
it's
after?
it's further away from the other weakness. The
Yeah,
weakness
both
is
rook
now spread
files.
further apart.
That's a really good point. How could this game have continued then? Let's say
Well,
black
let's
takes
just,
H4.
yeah, just take the pawn. Well, okay, I'm going to grab this. Now you must move the king. Otherwise, I will play e6 and win the knight. So you got to move the king. And now I'm threatening, virtually threatening mate. So if you try to avoid that, I come here, and I have a really nasty threat now of bishop to h or bishop to f7, and then rook to a1 mate. This bishop move is unnecessary because it forces the king to this square. Otherwise, I mean, we could play the rook immediately, but the bishop would block. And there's nothing. There's no way to prevent this. There's nothing you can do here.
Yeah, the
I
top
mean,
engine move is a mate in 10 for white. Knight G6, bishop F7, and this knight's just going to get captured, and then mate's coming next.
yeah, there's really nothing. But as we were saying all along, if that rook ever gets in, it is game over. And Sargassian found a really nice way to get the rook in. Just a really clean way of slowly picking and prodding and improving. He improved his bishop, he improved his pawns, he improved his king, and eventually it was just a simple threat of winning a single pawn that was enough to cause resignation from Shirov. So, really beautiful game.
Yeah, this was a great game. I think the only little nitpick right here is to play H4. I think that's a stronger continuation, but it's complicated. And he really just outplayed Shirov, both tactically and with endgame technique. Like he had no
And
issues at all.
this was quite a nice game because it was Armenia versus Spain, and this was the only win in the match. So that meant that Armenia took down Spain 2.5, 1.5, and that guarantees that Armenia finishes the event tied for match points with Uzbekistan.
Yep, and Uzbekistan had higher tiebreak points. Very impressive tiebreak too, 435 points. So they
Yeah.
get the win. And one thing I wanted to highlight with this Uzbekistan team, this player that played board 4 in the last round, Yakangir Bakidov, he's rated 2564. He had a 2813 performance rating, and there were multiple rounds where I kind of wanted to highlight his games. We just never got around to specifically picking his. But he won the board 4 prize for Uzbekistan, and
Oh,
I think
nice,
he carried the
nice.
team.
Who ended up with the board 1 prize? Was it old Gukesh?
Yep,
Yeah,
Gukesh
he
board
finished
1,
9 out of 11. He had a draw today.
Nihal Sarin board 2. So two India 2 players winning board prizes on 1 and 2.
Which makes you wonder, how did they end up in third overall? I mean, they had a clear third, but if their top two boards won gold prizes, that must mean that their bottom boards, Prague and Sadwani, must have fallen a little short for them, or they would have finished first overall.
Prague was actually third for the board prize on board 3. Board 4, though, they didn't have anyone in the top 20.
So yeah, Sadwani finished 5.5 out of 8. That's really not so bad.
Yeah, and he
I
was
mean,
counted as board 5.
okay. How are their board four then?
Is their oldest player, Adiban.
Ah,
The 4 youngsters all did really well.
yeah, it was a phenomenal match for them. They did quite well. So we have India 2 and India tied for third place. Moldova and the United States and Hungary. Oh, sorry, India. No, India 2 got clear. They got clear
Clear
third.
third on board points, match points.
Yeah, India, Moldova, and the United States come in with as a shared fourth. How did old Norway do? Magnus was apparently so upset that he didn't even bother to show up for the last round. So they had Aran Tari finish things out for them.
Yeah, where did they end up? What place are they? I can't even find them. Oh, 59.
61st.
Wow.
Yeah, I have them in 61st.
And they were the 3
Uh,
seed.
what's that?
They were the 3 seed, and they got 59th or 61st
Yeah,
place.
terrible, terrible, terrible event for them. Terrible. We were
You
talking
know,
about Serbia. They finished in 21st place. Not bad at all. And then my beloved Puffins, Iceland. Iceland finished ahead of Norway.
that's impressive.
Yeah, that is pretty impressive. I mean, they were way, way down the list. So yeah, not a bad result. Azerbaijan, which normally finishes quite strong, they were in eighth, I guess. Yeah.
Kinda wanna look at the US team. Let's talk about what went wrong for the US because they were just dominant based on rating, almost 100 points higher than the top teams.
Well, I think you can sum up a lot of what went wrong in that Fabi went 5 out of 10.
Yeah.
He played down literally every single match. Every single match he played down, and he only had 5.5. I mean, Wesley only had 7 out of 10, which is not particularly impressive. Lanier, 6.5 out of 10. Shanky, 4.5 out of 7. I mean, you can't do that and expect to do better than they did.
So every player underperformed. Aronian, kind of similar to Fabiano, 50% score. He also played down every single round on board 2. Um, do you think they needed Hikaru or like what's the psychology behind it? Why did they do so bad and over so many rounds? Because you would think like 11 rounds, 4 boards per round, like the numbers should just revert to the mean at some point. Like US should just come back and win a bunch of matches.
Well, so I absolutely they're going to regress to the mean. It just might take more than 11 games.
Yeah, we need like a 50 game Olympiad.
Well, I'm just saying, like, because when we calculated odds when we did our preview match, and we gave them what only an 8% chance of losing a match at any given match.
Yeah.
Well, they only lost one match, which if you look at 11 matches, 8% is roughly one match. So I mean, they kind of performed in the margin of error. They just didn't perform any better than that. So I think it was just an event that just didn't go well for them. I don't think there's any super major causes to it. They didn't play well, and they continue to not play well. I like how we talk about how terrible they played. I mean, they did tie for fourth. So I mean, it's not so terrible.
Yeah, I think this is a huge coming out party for the India teams. You know, India has had a huge chess movement over the past couple of years. Their youngsters, as we've seen now in India too, super strong, and they're just stacked. I mean, they had 3 teams in this event, and their top 2 teams get 3rd and 4th place. That's insane. That's really good. That's 10 players. That's so much depth. 10 players to make those first 2 teams up.
Yeah, the India team, the India A squad, they didn't really perform any better than the US team did, though, to be perfectly honest. I mean, their board three finished 8.5 out of 11. That was their by far strongest performance.
And he was one of
Harry
their
Krishna,
youngsters. That's
yeah.
promising.
Harry Krishna, just 5.5 out of 10. Their board one, 5.5 out of 10. I mean, he had some relatively low rated players too. I mean, but he anytime he played anyone at 2,600 or above, he only had one win playing people that are above 2,600.
Yeah, so I think the India 1 players slightly underperformed. The US players underperformed a little bit more, but both of those teams I think definitely were expecting to get on the podium.
Yeah, definitely the case. Definitely the case. So
This was really fun, JD. This is the closest I've ever followed an Olympiad, like going through all the games and highlighting them with you. This was awesome. I appreciate
great.
doing
Yeah, yeah.
this.
Well, we have Rapid and Blitz championships in the Grand Chess Tour coming up, so maybe we can do more of this.
Yeah, let us know in the comments. What did you think about this? And do you want to see more event coverage? Because I think JD and I are both up for doing it. This has been a really good time.
All right.
Make sure to subscribe if you're not a subscriber and you're just finding us through these recaps. Give us a thumbs up, and we'll see you guys later. Have a good one.
Bye, guys.